My poem is by Corinne Hales, and it's called Power. The first thing the checklist asks you to do is to read the poem closely and to read it out loud. I'm not going to read it out loud here because I've read it out loud already a couple of times, but there are things that you pick up when you slow down enough to read it out loud. So don't skip that step. Although it appears that I'm skipping it here right now. Don't skip it, because I haven't. Then they ask you to go through the second thing is to go through it line by line. Don't skip any lines or stanzas or any key details, but just put in your own words what the lines say. For example, in this first line right here at the top of the page, no one we knew had ever stopped a train before. Okay, we didn't know anybody who had ever stopped a train. Yeah, that's sort of putting it in your own words. Second line, we were waiting for one and we're hardly breathing. We laid down, my brother and I laid down in a ditch. It's a dry ditch. We were watching the scarecrow that we'd made out of stuffed newspapers and shirt and pants, and that we had stretched across the railroad tracks. His heart is pounding against the ground as they begin to hear the trains break. And of course they're triumphant. We had done it. Then the train breaks in front of them, and the wheels tear through the flannel and the denim and shred them to bits. And finally the train stops. His brother jabs at him, points down the track. The engineer comes out of the train, running in their direction, screaming and waving his arms that he'd kill you. Whatever. Then close to the spot where they had hid, he stomped and cursed at the rags and papers scattered over the gravel. Well, this is a little bit hard to paraphrase because it's mostly narrative, but I'm going to try anyway. The narrator tries to remember who originally had the red shirt, but from thinking back, it seems he can't remember. But he can remember the railroad engineer dropping to his knees and crying. The one brother can't stop watching. The other brother can't bear listening. The next thing it asks you to do is to write out your paraphrase as prose. I'm not going to do that right now, but I am going to state what the literal meaning of the poem is. Two young brothers, create a scarecrow, which they then put on the railroad tracks, with their goal being to stop a train. And they do stop it. And it tears up the scarecrow, and unexpectedly, the engineer comes out of the train, screaming and yelling, upset, kicking at the rags they'd stuffed into the scarecrow and the newspapers, for what the boys considered a joke. And then one of the brothers tries to remember who was the last one to wear the red shirt, who it belonged to. But instead, all he can remember is watching the man cry. And he couldn't help but watch. and his brother who couldn't listen. The last thing, one of the last things they say in the checklist is to don't worry about deeper meaning, but you can mark things that you find interesting. For example, I love this right here when he's talking about belly down in a dry ditch. Those D sounds are interesting. I'm not sure what they mean, if anything, but they are interesting. I love the image here of the heart and the cool ground. I think that's life and, of course, death. And why did he say terrible long screech instead of a long, or she, rather, long, terrible screech? Seems like an interesting choice in rhythm there. These iron wheels tearing like time. So you get that little I rhyme there. And you get the T's repeated. Bound to be a reason for that. And one of the last things that I found interesting is at the very end here, where we have a falling sound. Falling. Da, da. That's how you mark it when you scan it. So, and the man was falling, sobbing to his knees. To his knees. And they couldn't stop watching. So this sound pattern right here sort of sounds like falling. Da-da. And of course at the end it's really so sad how he can't stop watching and his brother can't listen. A lot going on in the poem. It's very cool. Okay, so that's sort of writing a paraphrase checklist without doing the writing. But I did want to go over the poem with you just to show you how to begin to deal with these things.